Well, hello there. If you're new here, my name's Brooke and I enjoy researching strange occurrences, true crime, conspiracy theories, etc., and sharing my findings with like-minded and curious individuals. If you feel that you fit that description, please consider hitting the subscribe button down below. I post every single week. Every once in a while, I like to take a break from the doom and gloom of true crime and explore some other equally mind-blowing cases. Let me just tell you, this is 100% that. We have a lot to get through today, so without further ado, let's just jump right into it, shall we? Gerald Daniel Blanchard was born in Winnipeg, Canada, circa 1972, and adopted at only 6 days old. His biological parents were only 15 and 17 years old at the time of his birth, and they wanted to offer him the life and opportunities that they just logistically weren't in the position to provide at such young ages. His adoptive parents had been fairly well off up until 1980, when they unfortunately divorced, and Gerald and his sister relocated to Omaha, Nebraska with their mother and lived a much more financially restricted lifestyle. Gerald was enrolled into a public school called Boys Town, which is located in the inner city of Omaha and intended for the education of troubled youths. However, Gerald really didn't fit that description. Upon first glance, Gerald was a small, nerdy kid who kept to himself and stayed quiet. He wore thick glasses and spoke with a slight speech impediment. Although he struggled with learning disabilities such as dyslexia, Gerald was far from unintelligent. In his free time, he enjoyed taking apart electronics and in general just analyzing how things in the world worked. He was definitely a sit back and observe type of person. His mother worked her hardest to keep food on the table and the bills paid, but it seemed like an uphill battle constantly. Gerald began developing a dislike for banks in general, as they gave his mother absolutely no mercy while she struggled to pay the mortgage and keep her small family afloat. So when Gerald went to school with troubled teens, he began to observe their patterns and realized that there were plenty of money-making opportunities to be had, which he could help lighten the load on his mother and contribute to the household. At first, it just started out as stealing candy here and there, and then larger food items to help feed the family, but the adrenaline rush of it all was instantly addicting, and he began taking anything and everything, not only because it could make he and his family's lives a little bit easier financially, but just for the simple fact that he could get away with it so easily. The bigger the score, the greater the rush. He would steal small, insignificant things like maps from the gas station, all the way up to electronics from tech stores. This led him to acquiring a video camera, which he would use to film himself getting away with these thefts. Not a whole lot of teens in the 80s had access to video cameras, so this not only made Gerald look a whole lot cooler to his peers than his appearance allowed, but when they saw the videos of him brazenly robbing local stores, he earned a whole lot of street cred. Kids that typically would have targeted and made fun of him now held him to a certain regard, and Gerald loved this attention. He attracted all types of new friends and girls that he could show off to, and he overall just felt special having things that his peers couldn't, and that seems to be a ongoing theme of Gerald's life. Later on, Gerald's mother described her son living a sort of double life. To his peers, Gerald openly bragged and boasted about his criminal activities. It was what he was known for, his persona, if you will. But to his friends and those that he kept especially close, he didn't utter a single word about what he was doing behind the scenes. They had no idea that he was this showboaty criminal and that he would hide his caches away in school lockers or scattered around at different friends' houses. Gerald's petty thefts continued to escalate year by year. Gerald's friends joined in on his antics, knowing that he'd act as the front man, and with his skills, they had no worry of getting caught. That was until Easter Sunday of 1987. Gerald had dedicated much of his spare time to toying around with and understanding the alarm system of his local Radio Shack. That Sunday, the store was closed for the holiday, and 15-year-old Gerald gathered some friends, somehow managed to get a hold of a U-Haul and pull up to the store. Within minutes, Gerald disarmed the alarm system, and he and his friends emptied out the entire store, loading tens of thousands of dollars worth of merchandise into this moving truck that they'd acquired. Since this was obviously such a huge gain, Gerald had to come up with a cover story in case his loved ones began questioning where all of this stuff came from. If his mother ever did see the stolen items or question where he was getting money, he would claim that he'd gotten them from cheap thrift stores and was reselling them. Not much later, however, the police would break down the door of Gerald's family home and turn it completely upside down, recovering all of the stolen electronics and taking the teen into custody. When facing a grand theft charge in court, the judge saw Gerald as a young, nerdy white boy who just stole some electronics. Any major punishment was just not in the cards, and Gerald only served months in juvenile detention, followed by 2 years probation. Gerald has acknowledged that his outward appearance worked in his favor, especially in his youth. The less nerdy and or more ethnically diverse peers who would join him in his antics or try and replicate them in their own more discreet ways would almost always face much harsher consequences than Gerald. So having gotten caught for the very first time at clearing out a Radio Shack and spending 3 months in juvie, a typical 15-year-old kid might be a bit scared straight and reconsider their actions. Not Gerald. No, of course not. Supposedly, the probation officer assigned to Gerald knew about his criminal mischief and wanted in on it. It wasn't long before the 15-year-old was running a stolen Radio Shack merchandise ring and selling them to several probation officers. Phones, stereos, answering machines. Gerald was playing with the exact fire that had gotten him locked up in the first place, and he was making it work in his favor. As the saying goes, practice makes perfect, and that definitely rings true for Gerald. He figured out a way to rig a cash register that he'd stolen in a way that would print out fake receipts for the items that he had stolen, so then he could return the items to the store for cash. If he was ever pulled over and questioned by police as to how a teen boy managed to buy all of these things, Gerald had receipts for everything. As a 16-year-old, Gerald was making between $4,000 and $8,000 a week easily using just this method. Something that he had originally used to help support his mother and sister quickly escalated beyond just needing the bare minimum. It's safe to say that he was raking in the dough to the point where he had to start hiding it around his yard in order to avoid any suspicion. Friends would also claim that Gerald began involving himself in local gang activity in efforts to launder his money, which made his friends extremely uneasy. At 16 years old, Gerald managed to save up $100,000 and buy his own home. Also, can I just say, I wish $100,000 went as far as it did today in the 80s, because maybe the majority of my generation and future generations wouldn't be bound to a lifetime of renting, waiting for a large inheritance, or any other unpredictable opportunity to fall into their lap. $100,000 would have a better chance of securing me a cardboard box on the side of the freeway in this glorious year of 2023, if we're being honest. Anyways, I digress. So despite his incomprehensible success at such a young age, his crimes were clearly not about reaching a certain level of financial freedom. His addiction to thrill was no longer being met by shoplifting, pickpocketing, or even robberies of entire stores. He began plotting more intricate methods of getting his fix, but these techniques didn't come free of cost. In 1993, Gerald and a friend plotted insurance fraud in the state of Iowa, where they lit a vehicle on fire with the intention of collecting the insurance money. After incinerating the car and crossing paths with a nearby police officer responding to the fire, Gerald tried to act nonchalant about everything, but the smell of gasoline on his clothing definitely was not fooling anyone. As the officer took him into custody and back to the police department for questioning, Gerald couldn't help but feel disrespected by the police officer. Not only did authority figures just leave a bad taste in his mouth to begin with, but he was probably feeling a little defeated in the fact that he got caught, and this officer was speaking to him as if he were just some stupid kid doing some stupid things. Gerald is objectively far from unintelligent considering his track record, and he wasn't just gonna let this police officer patronize him and continue riding the ego boost that came from his successful arrest. So after questioning him and leaving the interrogation room briefly, police were shocked to return and find that Gerald was nowhere to be found. The entire department proceeded proceeds to freak out because I'm sure it's not every day that a suspect in custody is able to just seemingly vanish out of thin air in a locked room. They search diligently throughout the station and even circle the surrounding areas in the hunt for Gerald, but alas, no luck. They eventually have to call it a night and take the loss, but little did they know Gerald was watching the entire time. When police had briefly stepped out of the interrogation room, Gerald climbed on top of the table, slid a ceiling panel to the side, and climbed up into the rafters, probably laughing internally at the fact that he'd outsmarted the officers that attempted to make him feel inferior. After hours and hours of watching the chaos within the department, Gerald was eventually able to climb out of the ceiling after all of the officers had gone home for the night. It was then that he found the desk of his arresting officer, stole a picture of his family, his weapon, his police badge, and his walkie-talkie. And for the icing on the cake, he took a bullet out of the gun, drew a smiley face on it, and left it in the middle of the desk. I'm not excusing any of Gerald's actions because of course he was absolutely in the wrong here, but I can only imagine the sense of payback that he got from doing this. You know when somebody makes you mad and you're just thinking of all of the ways that you could get back at them, but you never actually get the opportunity to do it? And on top of his thrill-seeking addiction, I'm sure he was just feeling on top of the world. So after leaving this little present for authorities to return to in the morning, Gerald figured that he would head over to his mother's house to hide out. Not only was he worn out and reaching what felt like a dead end, he thought that going to his family home would be the most obvious place in the world to hide out, and therefore the police wouldn't bother checking. A bit of reverse psychology is what he tried, but unfortunately that is not how things played out, and it wasn't long before the SWAT team was breaking down the door and arresting him once again. This is now the second time that Gerald's mom has had her door kicked down by a SWAT team due to no fault of her own, and honestly that's gotta be terrifying. Like I gotta hand it to her, honestly. Once Gerald is driven to the Omaha Central Police Department, the officers stepped out of the police cruiser for routine security checks. Within seconds, Gerald managed to maneuver his handcuffs in such a way that he was able to jump in the front seat of the car, grab the steering wheel, hit the policeman with the car, and drive off. Luckily, the officer wasn't injured in any significant way, but I'm sure he was absolutely speechless. I can only imagine the grief that he received from his fellow officers in letting a suspect jump into the front seat of his cruiser, hit him, and drive away. After driving through a police checkpoint and going on about a 10-minute chase by both car and foot, Gerald is finally apprehended and taken to jail. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison for second-degree arson and second-degree theft, but was released after 4 years and deported back to his birth country of Canada in 1997. Following his prison release and deportation, Gerald basically had to start over from scratch. He had no money and nowhere to live, and obviously he wasn't going to be content in just barely scraping by after the life he had been leading before his prison sentence. So in true Gerald fashion, he did not skip a beat when it came to reigniting his life of crime. He immediately took the $10 given to him for a bus ticket, bought a disposable camera, copied the receipt, stole hundreds of dollars worth of other disposable cameras, and returned them for cash the same day. He was fully back in business. It was also around this time that he met his soon-to-be wife, Ramona. The two immediately hit it off, and soon enough they were traveling the world together and enjoying all of the finer things that a life of crime has to offer a young couple. Ramona actually came from an extremely well-off family since her parents were successful real estate owners, so there were really no red flags as to how Gerald and Ramona were affording all of these luxurious goods and vacations. As far as Gerald's loved ones were concerned, he had learned his lesson in prison and forwent his adrenaline addiction. In reality, it wasn't long before he decided that these small-time robberies he'd become familiar with in the past 20 years were no longer worth the hassle, and if he could cash in even bigger, why not try? In 2004, he began targeting not only ATMs, but entire entire banks directly. He would choose a bank that he believed could be infiltrated, rent a hotel room across the street, and monitor every possible activity that went on inside and out of that branch. For about a month, he studied the staff rotation, the architectural layouts, the security measures, everything. He would purchase replicas of the technology that these banks used and repeatedly practice taking them apart and putting them back together until he knew them like the back of his hand. He would even set up replica obstacle courses in his hotel room so that he could perfectly time each and every movement. Of course, Gerald has to be on the level of like a criminal mastermind to put this type of planning and effort into these intricate heists, but he's personally accredited much of his success to simply having the self-confidence to believe that he can get away with whatever he sets his mind to. I actually think that's a really powerful message that many of us need to implement into our daily lives. So if you decide to take anything from this video, I would say that just having self-confidence is majority of the battle, but maybe like put that towards something with a bit more morality and a little bit less legal implications. But who am I to tell you what to do? During these dozens of ATM and bank robberies from Canadian coast to coast, he could expect to take home between $250,000 and $750,000 each time, and with every heist, he improved his techniques. And every time police would arrive on the scene of these robberies, they were left completely dumbfounded. It's not every day that your average Joe Schmo successfully manages to rob a bank without a single trace. Officers that had been in their line of work for decades at this point had never seen anything like it, and didn't even believe it was possible until they saw the cases missing hundreds of thousands of dollars with their own eyes. Although authorities recognized that they were dealing with an ingenious criminal, and it would take a lot of time and manpower to stop the string of robberies, they knew it had to be done. So they compiled a group of about 12 detectives to work on a task force dedicated to what they called Project Kite. In their investigations, they discovered that the few times Gerald had been caught during his robberies in Canada, he'd used over 20 aliases in order to cover his trail and make it seem like he never had a criminal record. Each time he got in trouble, it was a slap on the wrist. They also found the many extravagant purchases and photos of the glamorous vacations that Gerald had enjoyed over the years thanks to his dirty money, indicating that he'd been committing crimes for years. Worst of all, they had wiretapped Gerald's phone and listened to the numerous conversations he had with his accomplices, detailing the specifics of their crimes. Meanwhile, Gerald was concocting his next big burglary. He'd caught word that the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce was building one large branch to take place of several pre-existing smaller branches. Now, of course, when banks are under construction, there isn't a fully formed security system in place yet, and therefore there's no money inside. So while this empty, half-built building doesn't sound too compelling to the average person, Gerald saw it as an absolute gold mine. He saw the skeleton of this bank as his next big break. After buying a construction vest, hard hat, and cheap baby monitor at a local store, Gerald waltzed right over and into the partially built CIBC branch and hid the baby monitor inside of a wall. From that point on, Gerald was able to see and hear everything that was going on inside of the construction site, from timelines to certain security techniques and everything in between. After the ATMs had been installed within the new branch, Gerald took the time to go back into the bank after construction hours and rewire the machines in order to disarm the motion sensors and manipulate the locking mechanisms so that he could later break in undetected once they'd been filled with cash. After about a year of painstakingly monitoring the construction of the new CIBC branch, Gerald and two accomplices pulled off the heist and walked away with $750,000. And they thought they'd completely gotten away with it. Until the next morning, that is. When the bank manager came in the next morning and realized that the ATMs had been completely wiped clean, he immediately called the police. As police were inspecting the crime scene and searching for any evidence of the perpetrators, Gerald was actually still watching them through the baby monitor that he had planted months ago, and was probably smiling at the fact that he'd pulled off yet another seamless robbery and these cops were never going to catch him. Well, it turns out that Gerald made a grave mistake. The previous night during the robbery, Gerald had parked his rental van at a Walmart across the street. That particular night, a Walmart employee took it upon themselves to write down some of the license plate numbers of vehicles that were parked in the parking lot. So when this employee heard that the CIBC across the street was robbed, they gladly offered up these license plate numbers to authorities, and what do you know? Gerald Blanchard's name was one of the first to pop up when they researched the license plate information. So upon seeing his impending demise occur right before his eyes, Gerald is starting to sweat a little bit. But not too much, because his quick thinking leads him to call in an anonymous tip to police right then and there. He tells police that he knows who robbed the bank, and they're gonna do it again, but with this time, guns blazing. Police are understandably concerned about this threat/promise, which leads them to focus on this robber coming to them rather than them actively trying to seek out the robber. Just as Gerald planned, he had distracted police just long enough to hop on a plane and get far, far away from this catastrophe. Around the same time, Gerald was planning his next intricate bank robbery while also involving himself in other illegal activities such as arms trafficking. Even though Gerald's analytical skills were top-notch, he was still humble enough to know that two heads were better than one. So he began gathering some of his most trustworthy accomplices to begin working with a man overseas named Sergei, aka The Boss. The Boss was one of Europe's most notorious credit card fraudsters, which was admirable to Gerald. Whenever The Boss had a job for Gerald to take care of, no matter how short notice or how long of a flight he had to take to get there, Gerald was there at the drop of a hat. Not only did Gerald just want to display a certain level of respect to his boss/mentor, but nobody really wants to find out what'll happen if they cross a continental bigwig. Those situations typically don't end very well. One day in 2006, the boss drops a job in Gerald's lap, which requires him to fly to Egypt, wear a burqa as a disguise, and withdraw money from blank debit cards until ATMs were completely empty. I'm not exactly sure how this works, hence why I'm not a multi-millionaire, but hey, if you happen to find out, let me know. I mean, definitely don't tell me, because who wants free money anyways? That's like so gross and wrong. I'm kidding, okay? During this Egypt trip, one of Gerald's associates ended up betraying both Gerald and the boss by running off with $100,000 and seemingly dropping off the face of the earth. And since he's not around to see his punishment, Gerald was the next in line. The boss's people began threatening Gerald's life, and they began wondering if Gerald was really trustworthy at all, or if he was involved with his accomplice's robbery of the boss. After much threatening and just general fear for his life, Gerald was eventually able to return to Canada, but not without the boss constantly breathing down his neck in order to recoup the money that his accomplice had run off with. Since law enforcement had been keeping an eye on him and realized that dangerous weapons were becoming involved, they decided it was finally time to just take Gerald and his ring of criminals down with the extensive evidence that they had before these weapons began harming the general public. So in 2007, law enforcement officers across Canada made simultaneous arrests of Gerald Blanchard and 20 of his accomplices all at the same time. Luckily for the Project Kite task force, the man that they were dedicated to investigating extensively day after day was finally in custody, and they could finally get answers from the source as to who, what, when, where, and why all of these dozens of banks could be robbed. Upon speaking to Gerald, he revealed a twist that would answer an international mystery that had gone unanswered for years. 1998 was a big year for Gerald, as it was the year that his most infamous heist took place. Gerald, along with his wife Ramona and her father, took a trip overseas to the country of Austria. While visiting the country, Ramona's father's wealth allowed them a private visit to the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, which is arguably one of the most important monuments in the country and home to many invaluable pieces of history. If we've learned anything about Gerald at this point, it's probably that he shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a place of this caliber, considering his track record, but as we've seen and will continue to find out, he's not exactly the type of person that can be put in a cell with the key thrown away forever. So during his visit to the Schönbrunn Palace, Gerald was making sure to take plenty of pictures and videos, which of course isn't out of the norm for your typical museum guests. But unlike your typical patron, Gerald was not simply observing and admiring art and history. He was scoping out every square inch of the palace's layout so that he could go back and watch it later, plotting his next ploy. It was when Gerald spotted a particular artifact that he knew it would be his next target. Duchess Elizabeth Amalie Eugenie in Bavaria, also known as Sisi, became the Empress of Austria and the Queen of Hungary following her marriage to Emperor Franz Joseph in 1854. She's known as one of the most beautiful European women from the 19th century, likely aided in her unwavering dedication to fitness and beauty. I hate to say it, but she would have slayed being an influencer if she were around today. I'm sorry, I had to say it. She was particularly known for her extremely long hair that extended to the floor, which took about 3 hours of daily maintenance by her personal hairdresser. The pure length and weight of her hair often became uncomfortable, especially with all of the intricate braids and clips that she was made to wear. In one particular portrait of Sisi by Franz Winterhalter, Sisi gazes over her shoulder and shows off a set of 27 stunning diamond and pearl stars made especially for her. After Sisi's untimely death/assassination, the very last of her precious stars would take up real estate in a display case at the Schönbrunn Palace and eventually capture Gerald Blanchard's wandering eye. Allegedly, Gerald saw a window of opportunity in which he was alone in a particular room where the priceless artifact was. He loosened the screws on the display case and opened a window ever so slightly that it wasn't noticed by security. You would think that any museum containing such invaluable pieces of history would have security monitoring CCTV like 24/7, but apparently not. But I'm almost sure they do now after something like this happens. I don't know. So a few days later, after the museum had closed for the night, Gerald supposedly parachuted out of a small airplane, landed on the roof of the palace, disabled the alarms, and swapped out the original Sisi Star for a replica he had purchased in the gift shop during his prior visit. It's unclear if Gerald actually parachuted because he has been known to exaggerate details here and there, and he didn't happen to record this supposed jump that he took, but regardless of how he got into the museum, he definitely did do some plundering of the Sisi Star. It would take 2 entire weeks after the heist for anybody to even realize that a swap had been made. By that time, Gerald was chilling back in Canada, hiding his brand new accolade in the crawl space of his grandmother's home with zero fears of being caught. When the public found out about their country's prized artifact being stolen, they were understandably befuddled as to how such a thing could happen. Everybody was talking about it, and it's still a widely known fact by those familiar with Vienna. As word began to spread, the palace tried to do some damage control by releasing contradictory statements that the star had been recovered, mainly to discourage the public from turning to pawn shops trying to find it and pass it even further around. But the Sisi Star would not be relocated for a relatively long time. So going back to Winnipeg, where Gerald is sitting in jail after getting caught by the Project Kite team hot on his trail, Gerald is facing 16 different charges relating to fraud and robbery that could result in 168 years in prison. But luckily, he remembers that he has the ultimate bargaining chip to manipulate his legal troubles in his favor. So with the ball in Gerald's court just the way he likes it, he agrees to pay full restitution for the crimes he was being charged with and the return of the Sisi Star so long as he was granted leniency in his sentencing. And oh boy, was his sentencing lenient. In 2009, Gerald was sentenced to only 8 years in prison, but was released after serving only 2. After his release, Gerald supposedly began working an earnest job as a security consultant, but he did get arrested again in 2017 after stealing PlayStations from Best Buy. Which begs my question to you. Do you think that in the year of 2023, 6 years after his last arrest, Gerald Daniel Blanchard is still out here doing his mastermind fine thing. Personally, I think he is. He went to jail and prison several times before, and those short stints barely served as a speed bump in his road of criminality. If you've spent your whole life addicted to something, whether it be substances or a neurological response from a negative behavior, I kinda doubt like he would just stop so easily, especially when he didn't get any actual like treatment for this addiction. They just like threw him in jail for a few years while he was probably concocting all of these other plans up in his head. I don't think it was possible for him to just quit cold turkey. It seems more likely that he's just continued to perfect his ways and is just getting away with it more easily and more often. Overall, I think Gerald is one of the most interesting people I've ever looked into because this man's whole life was literally a movie. His loved ones and people who have known him in general say that if you take away the fact that his actions were extremely illegal, Gerald is undeniably a genius. He was all bark, all bite, and did exactly whatever he set his mind to. He's lived a life that only seems to be possible in movies. If you see any interview clips or photos of Gerald, it's actually sort of funny to see the contrast between his entire presentation and his actions. He really wasn't lying when he said his outward appearance has gotten him off the hook many times because the math just isn't mathing when you look at him. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video exploring the life and times of the world's most complex thief. I'd love to read your guys' thoughts in the comments along with any recommendations for future topics you'd like me to cover. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to talk true crime with me, and I will see you next time. Bye!